Hi, and welcome, everyone. My name is Megan McDonald, and I'm the Public Relations Manager here at CBIA. I'll be hosting today's webinar on the topic of cybersecurity and why you should protect yourself and your business from cyber attacks. First, I wanted to thank AT&T Bloom Shapiro, Cooperative Systems, and KeyBank for their generous sponsorship, making it possible to offer these sessions to you, our members, free of cost. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started on today's webinar. The format will be a slide presentation on your screen with voiceover commentary from our presenter, Kim. We will also have the capability of real-time Q&A using the text box on the right-hand side of your screen. There are two boxes, one for administrative matters and the other for posing questions to our presenter via texting function. We will try and respond as soon as possible, but as with a live presentation, sometimes the question may pertain to information we'll be covering further along the way, or due to a volume of questions, we can't respond to all at once. However, we can generally get to your questions in a timely manner during the presentation or at the end when we've reserved some time for final Q&A. So please don't hesitate to ask questions as they arise. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted on CBIA's website for later viewing by you or others in your organization who you think might benefit from this material. We'll be sending out an email afterwards to all attendees with a link to the event recording online at CBIA's website. Now to introduce today's presenter. Kim Bilderback is the Senior Director of AT&T Cybersecurity Solutions. He has over 10 years of experience on network security for organizations large and small. His team works with organizations nationwide designing and implementing AT&T security solutions in a multitude of environments, resulting in valuable knowledge base of threat trends and security best practices for enterprises of all sizes. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over. Here's Kim.
Yes. Hi, Megan, and everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here this morning to be able to present. The focus of my presentation is going to be around cybersecurity for small and medium businesses. I know that, with all the headlines in the news and all the big security breaches that get reported, like Equifax a couple of weeks ago, there's a misconception, really, that this is a large business problem, when in fact it actually is as much, if not more, a small and medium business risk problem as well. So I'm going to focus on small and medium businesses. I'm going to take us through why security matters to SMBs. I'm going to talk about an overview or an approach to better securing your environment. And it's not necessarily a costly way to secure your environment. It's really going to be around good cybersecurity hygiene. And then I'm going to end by conveying to you some free or low-cost resources that are available that you can reach out and access and bring in to help with your environment immediately after this call. So with that introduction, I'm going to get into the presentation. I will echo one more thing that Megan mentioned, which is that please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions, and we'll try to address them as soon as they come in. And again, there'll be opportunity for some Q&A at the end. So let's look at why security matters to small and medium businesses. In fact, if you look at the statistics, small business cyber attacks are on the rise. More hackers, more the organized crime that is trying to leverage vulnerabilities in business organizations are going after small businesses, because small businesses tend to be more vulnerable. In fact, as one of the bullet points here points out, they're the first target of choice for cyber attackers. So more vulnerable, kind of easier to get into. And the other thing is that many of the large business attacks that you read about or breaches that you read about and see on the news are actually accomplished by first going after a small business partner of the larger corporation. So small business tends to be the soft underbelly, if you will, of cybersecurity. The axiom in cybersecurity is not when will you get breached, it's do you know that you've been breached? And a couple other data points that support that are on the slide. It's 200 days or more before an attacker is discovered on average. So chances are there's already some amount of cyber attack activity going on in any one of our organizations. So some of the hygiene that I'm going to talk about is how do you uncover that? How do you prevent that? Many organizations have implemented firewalls and antivirus software on their computers, and they tend to think that that's going to take care of all the problems. Well, our research and industry research, our research at AT&T and industry research has shown that, in fact, 70% of the new malware that is so successful in exploiting vulnerability goes undetected by antivirus software. So if you're ever sitting there scratching your head and saying, okay, well, how can an Equifax be breached? They're a large, sophisticated organization. They must have technologies in place to protect themselves. Well, they do, but they don't have the right technologies in place because the malware is going undetected. I'm going to talk some about that. You're all hearing about ransomware in the news. It is exploding. There's not a day that goes by that somebody on my team or myself is not contacted by one of our customers who's been exploited by a ransomware attack and either is paying the bounty to have their data restored, or is brought to their knees because they can't operate because the ransomware is effective. And again, I'm going to talk about some of the good hygiene cybersecurity practices that will help with that. The net is this, and here's why I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. It is that 80% of the small and medium businesses that suffer a cybersecurity attack will go out of business. I think that's a very surprising fact to most organizations. I can tell you that the 80% has been verified in numerous studies. And the reason that 80% of the SMBs that suffer an attack will go out of business is the same reason that an SMB would go out of business if there's a fire, if there's a major theft, and that's just a cash flow issue. Cyber attacks can bring your business down. The liabilities associated with the consequence of a cyber attack can be so large that your organization doesn't have enough capital or cash flow to pay the penalties. So it really matters. It's not just an issue for large businesses. What are some of the reasons for why it matters to a small and medium business? Well, we typically think of things like theft and loss of brand value, right? And I think that's a mistake to just think about it from the point of view of theft and loss of brand value. We often hear from clients something like, well, I don't have anything of value. My data isn't valuable to a hacker. My customer's data isn't valuable to a hacker. Nobody's going to breach my environment. Whereas my colleague who runs our security consulting practice says, you as the customer don't get to make that decision. It's the hacker that's making the decision. So don't underestimate the value of your data, the value of your environment, because while you may be tempted to play it down, to a hacker, there may be considerations that you're not aware of that make breaching your environment valuable. That's only part of the story, is the value of the data and any loss of your brand value. I think these other 3 points on this slide are, in fact, more valuable. First is that we as owners of a business, we as officers of a business have a obligation that is written in federal and state laws, and I'm not going to cite all the federal laws. I don't know all the state laws in Connecticut, but essentially you have an obligation, we have an obligation to do what a prudent man would do, or a prudent person would do, to safeguard the information maintained in our business. And that applies, and there's a lot of federal regulations that specifically state what one must do relative to computer data. So if you, in running your environment, are running your business, running the computers that support your business, running the computers connected to networks that you leverage in transacting your business, are not taking prudent action to protect that environment, you are subject to prosecution and consequences of criminal negligence, and that often takes the role of fines, but it can also take the role of jail sentences. So you have an obligation to, or we have an obligation to take due care and due diligence in our IT infrastructure in our businesses to avoid criminal consequences. The other aspect is that you have an obligation to be able to show that you've tried to defend the data in your environment. Let me give you an analogy here, I think. If you were to have a convenience store, you would likely have video cameras in that convenience store, and you would have those video cameras trained on the cashiers and trained on the front door, and if ever there's theft or someone were to break in, you would call the police. The police would come in and they would say, okay, we're going to investigate. Let us look at your video to see who it might have been. Let's see if we can identify those individuals, and that will help us go and find the criminal. Well, in the same way that you would do that if you owned a convenience store, any other business that's connected to the internet and transacting business on the internet needs to have the digital equivalent of that video to provide the police. And those are called security logs. So if you get a security breach in your IT infrastructure and you want to call the state police or you want to call the FBI, they'll arrive and they'll say, here we are. Let us help you find who cracked into your system. Let us help us find the hacker. You're going to need to provide them log data at the video equivalent of the ins and outs, the requests that came in, the requests that went out, so that they can do forensic analysis on the activity and thereby track down the criminals. In the absence of that logging information, again, the equivalent of video in a convenience store, they're not going to be able to find who attacked your environment or breached your environment. And beyond that, you could be sued for negligence, both criminally and civilly, because you've not taken appropriate steps to have that information and to provide law enforcement. So that's an important consideration, often overlooked, is the notion of due care and legally defensible security. And then finally is another category that we all think about a lot, and in some industries we're very aware of them because we're obligated, and that is we have regulatory compliance because of the businesses that we're in. If you're in healthcare, you've got the High Trust Act and the Personal Information Acts covered under HIPAA. If you're in retail or financial services, you have the credit card payment compliance and penalties associated with that under PCI. And then in almost any other business, you have the financial regulations of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, the FFIEC, and then Sarbanes-Oxley. And all those regulatory or regulations, I should say, have built into them some amount of cybersecurity due diligence, essentially. So the net of the point here is small and medium businesses, as large businesses, are legally obligated to do due diligence to take steps to protect their IT infrastructure and to protect the data in their IT infrastructure. And if anything happens, it's important that you're able to demonstrate that due diligence has been done. And that's why I think it's important to care about cybersecurity. A couple of things that I put here that I wanted to just mention as examples of breaches is that, for some reason, this one really hasn't gotten much in the news, but Wendy's has some number of lawsuits. It's like 3 class action lawsuits against them because some of their franchises were hacked and the credit card data was stolen. So, that sounds pretty routine these days, right? Your credit cards get hacked at a major retail or fast food company like Wendy's, so they do all the standard things. They notify everybody that the credit cards have been hacked, and here's access to a credit reporting service for a year to see if any bad things start to happen. And you would think, well, okay, they're done with it. Well, they're not. I think about a year and a half into what's probably going to be multiple years of this many-million-dollar lawsuit, not coming from the government, not coming from their customers, surprisingly, but coming from investors in Wendy's. Another example is a T-shirt company out of Los Angeles. This T-shirt company was breached. Somebody hacked into their system for ordering and buying T-shirts, and as a consequence, they had to stop accepting credit cards for 4 months. And so for 4 months, they could not take orders. I mean, they limped along, they tried to do things over the phone, and these sorts of things, but they essentially had to launch a new website and restructure so that they could start to take orders. Now, that's where the failure comes in. That's where that 80% of small and medium businesses going out of business as a result of a breach comes into play, because you think about all the expenses that company had to take care of during those 4 months in terms of debt servicing and all the other sorts of things. This company, which is called AT&T, was able to survive because, they had the capital and they had the wherewithal to absorb the financial cost of not being able to transact business for 4 months. But not every organization can. So there's criminal consequences for not taking appropriate actions around cybersecurity. There's regulatory. There's loss of brand value. There's theft. And then finally, I just think, and what we recommend is if for no other reason, if that when you call the FBI or you call the state police and you ask them to come in because you've been breached, you need to be able to show what happened in your environment. You need to be able to produce the video of what's going on in your network and your connections to the internet so that the police and the FBI can help you out. So it matters. So you've got this risk of cyber threats. You've got the financial and the legal risks associated with cyber threats. What do you do to be able to secure your environment? Fundamentally, it's a wide battle. I describe it as World War III. There's certainly days that it feels like World War III around here. To be successful in thwarting attacks and to be able to demonstrate that you've done due diligence, you need to take a multi-layered approach. You need to think about securing your devices, your mobile phones, the computers in the office, the laptops, and there's a plethora of technologies that you can deploy to do that. Probably most of you have, in the form of firewalls and intrusion detection device and maybe some email filtering and stuff like that. But that's only part of the story. Additionally, you need to ensure the data that's in transit, the data that's going through the network, so that it's not intercepted, let's say, in a Starbucks, or it's not intercepted by somebody that's tapping into your one of the devices and doing what's called a man-in-the-middle attack and watching the transaction. And there are technologies to do that. Fewer organizations think about that, but that's a point of exploitation that needs to be covered as well. And then finally, the data at rest, the data that's stored, be it that it's stored in a cloud environment like Amazon Web Services, or in Microsoft's cloud or IBM's cloud, or a cloud application provider you might work with like Salesforce.com or some other applications. You need to make sure that the data is stored there as well, and that's usually accomplished through encryption and some other logging techniques. And then finally, you need to envelop all those kind of stacked security components, the endpoint, the connectivity, the data application, with a system that's observing, recording, and alerting to anomalies, and that's called a threat management detection and response service. And you'll find, and I'm not making this claim by any stretch of the imagination, but you'll find that on a lot of the breaches that occur, like Equifax 2 weeks ago, or the big Sony attack, or Home Depot that were so notable, they had deployed technologies to secure endpoint, technologies to secure connectivity and their data application. But what they missed was this observational component that ties it all together, that would spot the fact that some bad guy got into one of their systems and is filtrating or extracting things like files with credit card information. And that'll be subject for a future presentation about how all that works. It's quite fascinating. But also, suffice to say at this point, it's kind of like technologies like your credit card companies use, right? Where if you're in Hartford, Connecticut, and you live there and you're working there, and then all of a sudden there's a credit card activity in San Francisco, and you get an alert from your credit card company that says, hey, we see that you're, they don't give you all this language, but essentially technology is saying, hey, we see that you're in Hartford, and it looks like you're buying gas and other things in Hartford, but we've got this charge from a gas station in San Francisco. Is this a valid transaction? It's these, we're using observational technologies that observe that anomaly, and they alert you to that so that you can nip the problem in a bud from a credit card perspective, and you can also do the same thing from a cybersecurity perspective. And by the way, that sounds complex, which probably sounds like it's expensive, and it's really not, because there are a lot of security service providers that can provide cloud solutions that accomplish that observational activity for you, which is a transition to talking about why, from a cybersecurity due diligence perspective, it's worthwhile for a small and medium business to think about contracting with a managed security service provider to do security for them. Now, just from a completely risk management perspective, if something bad happens and you have to go to the court to defend yourself criminally or civilly, or if you want to involve public safety, it's convenient and it's also a good defense to be able to say, well, I contracted with AT&T as a security service provider, or IBM, or Verizon, or somebody else who can provide a managed security service which envelops a lot of the different components and ties them all together. That becomes a good demonstration or a worthwhile or worthy demonstration of having done due diligence. So we enhance, or managed security service providers in general enhance your security posture and framework. And the other thing is that the market for technologies and activities and process in cybersecurity is just unbelievable. And there's a new technology, there's a new vendor, there's a new regulation almost every day. And you'll see on this chart the number of different providers that are involved. And I think it's difficult, or it is difficult, and our customers tell us it's difficult to stay on top of the technology and evaluate what's appropriate or not. So a managed security service provider can help greatly with that. The other advantage of using a cybersecurity or a security service provider is that security service providers are going to keep your devices that are deployed to secure your environment current. Two great examples of this, the relevance of this have happened in the last 12 months. One is about a year ago, August of 2016, in the news, there was a big deal about how the NSA had been hacked and some of their technology had been stolen, and an organization reportedly out of Russia called Shadow Brokers was able to exploit vulnerabilities in organizations' firewalls. The day that was announced, our company as a managed security service providers and others were updating our customers' firewalls with patches that protected against that vulnerability. As an individual business owner, it's hard for you to be on top of the news and to know that the patches, the software updates required to protect against those vulnerabilities being exploited is available to take action to update them. A more recent example of that is in April of this year, there was the WannaCry ransomware virus that crippled 200,000 computers in 150 countries. This was big news. It was a big risk, and luckily it got stopped in Europe before it sort of invaded the United States, and we were somewhat insulated with it. The reality of that, though, is that those 200,000 computers in 150 countries need not have been exploited. The appropriate patch for that virus had been, or that ransomware attack had been released, and the Homeland Security had publicized the virus about 25 days before the WannaCry hit. And most organizations that were ahead of the curve had updated their software appropriately. And so even if the WannaCry virus hit their environment, they wouldn't have been exploited. This is part and parcel, keeping atop of and ahead of these kind of vulnerabilities, making sure your environment is hardened is why, particularly if you're an SMB, you would want to talk to a managed security service provider and consider those services. But beyond those services and paying money to an MSSP, where I'm in your shoes, I think, okay, fine, I can pay somebody to come and do this, but I can't afford it. And that's understandable. So let me talk about a couple basic best practices that start to demonstrate due diligence, right? And also start to get you in control of your environment and to make sure that you're secure. And there are a couple things of these. One is something called a vulnerability assessment, a vulnerability scan. And there are numerous really low-cost services that via the cloud can, when you contract with them, can come in to your environment on a quarterly basis, an annual basis, or even many organizations do this on a monthly basis, and they'll scan all the computers, all the IP devices on your network, and they will check the condition of those devices against a centralized database that the whole security industry uses to track vulnerabilities. And they'll give you a report, they'll give you a grade. Many services have an analyst that you can talk to, and they'll discover for you where you're at risk. They'll tell you where you're at risk. They'll help you with mitigating or remediating that risk. And then finally, many of these services can grade you. They'll give you a grade relative to other companies in your industry or other companies of your size. And then finally, as I said, you do this annually or you do this quarterly, you can check progress. You can gauge, is your environment becoming less secure or more secure? So at the very least, if anything happens and you need to defend what you've done to protect against it happening, having had a vulnerability scan and the results of that, and having tracked progress over time about making your environment less vulnerable is a good thing to do. And again, if you just want to Google it, I'm going to provide some resources here in a couple more slides. Look for vulnerability scanning services. I think you'll find it not too terribly expensive, and I think it's a great way to start wrapping your arms around the cybersecurity, your cybersecurity environment, and how to get ahead of it versus having it be ahead of you. The second thing that we would recommend, and this is surprising, I think, to many organizations, is that the weakest link is your employees. The most exploitable element in a business from a cybersecurity perspective are the people who are sitting using their computers every day on your behalf. You'll see that, generally speaking, this chart varies. It provides information in different types of industry, but generally, 80% of all security breaches are caused by user error. The single most important thing that can be done, or user error or user interaction, I should say, because it's not always that they're making an error, but it's, the user is interacting. The classic being, to digress for a second, the classic being somebody gets an email that says, here, click this link and, you're going to become a millionaire. Click this link and because we want to order something from you. Those kinds of hacks or those kinds of exploitations that involve humans, involve individuals, are what result in 80% of the breaches. So educating your employees, educating your users on potential risks and the things to look for will yield the single biggest return on investment for reducing your risk of exploitation. All technologies aside, all security service providers aside, just making your employees and your users more savvy and aware of the risk is the single most important thing that you can do, and it too is not so terribly expensive. And I'm going to talk about some of the options here in a minute, but basically there are services that you can subscribe to, or services that are free, where there's training in the form of videos that they can watch online and things that can be read. So let me get into some of the free resources specifically and leave you with some what I hope are really tangible takeaways, valuable things you can get off this call and go and Google or fire up your browser and check out that you might find would be helpful. The first is something that, frankly, I'm very proud that my company has done and made available for free and for free and for free and for free and for free. It's called a Cybersecurity Readiness Advisor. And you'll see here the URL, which I'll read just in case someone can't see it. It's https, actually, www.cybersecurityreadinessadvisor.com. Now, when you click on that link, you're going to be taken to a website that is going to prompt for several questions. And we contracted with the research firm IDC to develop a model that looks at a business and their cybersecurity practice based upon how these questions are answered, and it codifies or puts into categories whether the organization is passive, reactive, proactive, and progressive. Right? So that gives you kind of your stance, your organization's stance in being able to secure your environment. Beyond giving you the stance, it also quantifies financially what the cost of that stance might be, and it also gives some prescription about how you can remediate and improve your position. So if you're passive, there'll be kind of a recipe, if you will, of what you can do to move from passive to reactive. And this information is sent to you via a very nicely done PDF report format. I highly recommend it. It's just a great and free resource to, kind of do a self-assessment, if you will, and get a sanity check from a neutral third party. And I will tell you that we have no loop-back mechanism where we're going to try to call you or sell you anything. So not only is it free, but I think it's hassle-free as well. Highly recommended. The other resources that are available through AT&T, and these are free of charge, are these. We publish an insights report on cybersecurity on a trimester basis. If you go to this URL here, you'll see all the different insight reports, and they're very helpful in that they're written in plain English, and they really take a business perspective. It's not a technical document. It's more, if you're the owner, if you're on the board of directors, here's the things you ought to be thinking about. For the more technically minded, we have a very powerful video that gets produced by our security gurus monthly. And they talk about observations of the threat landscape in the given week, things that seem to be trending, things to look out for, and make recommendations on how to protect against them. And that's called the AT&T Security Weekly Cyber Threat Updates. We have a Security Resource Center that's available, It's publications that people like me, and people that are a lot smarter than me, have written and and are sharing with the greater cybersecurity community. Most of these are targeted to, again, sort of the business perspective, somewhat technical, but I think mostly focused on the business implications, risk, and what to think about. Then from just sort of a product point of view, you can, and getting a sense of what a managed security service provider might be able to offer, there's the AT&T Security Customer Marketing website, and I recommend that as well. Again, you're going to see what kind of services an MSSP can provide, but you're going to learn generally about various technologies and services in cybersecurity. And then finally, and I guess this is somewhat biased, there's an article here on the CIA Triad and the relevance for a business. And CIA Triad is the foundation of good cybersecurity practice, which is confidentiality, integrity, and access. And I actually wrote this one, and it's an article about how it's not so much about, and if you're looking at cybersecurity expense, it's not enough to look at it from theft, but, from avoidance, but from a perspective of what's the value of your brand, what's the risk associated with a breach. And so I think it's interesting read. And finally, and my last slide here is a list of free cybersecurity resources that I highly recommend. They're put out either by the federal government or some industry trade organizations. The first is the Small and Medium Business Cybersecurity Planner that's put out by the Federal Communications Commission. And this, again, in the same way the vulnerability scanner is a good way, scanning is a good way to start thinking about your organization and how you might go about securing it. The Cybersecurity Planner is really a cookbook of how to, sort of implement best practices, demonstrate due diligence, and can give you a whole plan, really, for securing your environment. I mentioned employee awareness training and the importance of that and how employees and users are responsible for 80% of the breaches. Well, you can get an employee awareness training program at this trade industry website. I think it's well worthwhile checking out. In terms of what to do if you get breached, there's a data breach response plan workbook that's available. There's also in the category of good cybersecurity hygiene, there's an organization that's funded by the federal government that's called Stay Safe Online. They have a mantra that applies to employees I like, which is stop, think, and then connect. How to protect yourself and help keep the web a safer place for everyone. And you can get information, it's good employee reference at their website. Then finally, you get into sort of hardcore things from the federal government, mobile phone security from the FCC, Department of Homeland Security, which is funding the Stop, Think, and Connect. There's a resource specifically for small businesses. And then finally, the definitive Department of Homeland Security update site, which is the Computer Emergency Readiness Team under Department of Homeland Security at this website, https www.uscert.gov. Things like WannaCry, as an example, are published there, and you can get emails from CERT that make you aware of things like WannaCry weeks in advance of it being a problem, or if not weeks in advance of it being a problem, almost immediately upon there being a problem. So help yourself to these. I know, excuse me, I've read a lot, and you've just seen displayed up on the screen. So I'd urge you to check back later if you want to get the specific URLs when this is uploaded and made available to you. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope that's been insightful. And we're right at 15 minutes left in the hour. So I'll stop and see if there are any questions that I might be able to help with. And I'll also turn it back to Megan to add any words in closing as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. That was very informational. I think the thing that's going to stick with me is how many businesses actually go out of business as a result of the cyber attack, and that kind of put it into perspective for me. That was a big number you threw out there.
It is a big number.
Don't see any questions coming through. If it's okay with you, Kim, I'd like to throw it out there. Questions come up afterwards. It happens to me all the time. If anyone has a question after this, they want to reach out to us here at CBIA, and we can connect and make sure we get an answer to that question. But we can wait a couple more minutes to see if anything comes up.
Sure.
And as we wait, I just wanted to remind everyone on the call that this was the first of our series of 5 webinars on cybersecurity. Our next one is Wednesday, October 11th, and that's going to look specifically at what kind of cybersecurity plan you should have in place. That'll be hosted by myself again, and it will be Jeff Ziplow from Bloom Shapiro who will give it an overview of that. And then we have one October 25th, November 16th, and December 7th, all looking at different degrees of cybersecurity, employee engagement, what do you do after you've been attacked, and sort of protection and recovery, where you go from there. And so some of you might have registered for all 5. If not, you'll be receiving some more information in your email in the coming days and weeks to sign up, so we hope that everyone will do that. But I haven't seen anything come through, so if, we can probably go ahead and close it out. Like I said, any questions that come through later, please don't hesitate to reach out to CBIA and we'll connect you. Kim, I thank you very much for your great presentation today. We did get someone said, thank you for the information, very helpful and insightful.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Just as I was saying, it was. This is a big concept. It can certainly seem overwhelming, but I think that this was a great step in getting people educated on what they should be focusing on. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. And as you said, any questions that come up, Megan, I'm happy to answer. Also, if anyone wants to just schedule a one-on-one call with me or whatever, I'm happy to oblige.
Great.
All right. Thanks, all.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.